Thank you, everyone, and good morning. I hope everybody's had a good day. So let me start. Let me start with one or two things. Just in terms of Howard, if I'm correct, is it the Annabelle Lindsay School of Social Work? Yes. And many of you may not know, but a lot of people use the term intersectionality. She probably wrote the first report on intersectionality in the early 60s. She didn't use the term intersectionality, that's a recent term, but it was the combination of being old and black in the United States. Also, my son presently finished from Howard, and he is currently at the Howard Homecoming. So my talk today is on extended families and congregational support networks. And I'm going to cover a lot of issues. This talk will be, at least in the beginning, pretty personal. So this is my basic outline: segregation, civil rights, the time I spent in Nashville, Tennessee, what got me into this area of research. Then the main focus on extended family support networks. And if we have time, I'm going to get into some of my newer work on microaggressions. I thought that this might be particularly important for social workers because that is a term that I know in the School of Social Work in Michigan we use a lot. And I know that a lot of the research on that topic is fairly misunderstood. I want to acknowledge a few people. First, the previous Carl Scott lecturers, who some of them are my friends. Larry Davis and I were grad students together. We lived on the same block for several years. Richard English was one of my dissertation advisors, and I was John Wallace's dissertation advisor. And then my colleagues, and friends, Lorraine Gutierrez and Mike Spencer, who are both at University of Michigan, though Mike, unfortunately, is moving on to another university. Also want to mention my chairs, and this is pictures of Harold Johnson and Sheila Feld, who are well-known scholars. And as I said, I'm going to get relatively personal here. So this is the home that I grew up in. This is Nashville, Tennessee. This is, for people who may know Nashville, this is North Nashville, close to maybe a half a block from Meharry Medical College. That's my nephew James in the picture. You're going to see a lot of pictures of my family. And that house during that period, though it's only 1,000 square feet, built in 1950s in a black neighborhood, was a big-time house. Okay, again, we want to put this in perspective. That people used to, that when my friends and my parents came, my parents would give them a tour of a 1,000 square foot house. And before I start, I want to mention one family member. I have a family member in the audience. Vicki, could you stand up for a second? This is my niece, Vicki. And I have a picture of an old picture of Vicki in here also. So this is my family. This is taken in 1965. The cute young man in the middle is me. But also, I want to most importantly mention my aunt, Lovey. And this is her. If you note here, she was born in 1877. Okay. And what's also important by being born in 1877 is that her father was a slave, and that her mother was the offspring of a slave and a slave master. And so in my recent talks, I teach a course on race and racism, and I cover slavery, and it's hard for students to believe that there could be a connection, okay, over that many years. But I just wanted to give you an idea. And when I grew up in Nashville, I grew up during Jim Crow. Everything was segregated. Everything was, again, there were periods where things were desegregated, but not everything. And it permeated absolutely everything. So African American schools got second and third hand books. The YMCAs in the black neighborhoods were maybe 1/5 of the quality of the YMCAs in white neighborhoods. I had a friend, Charles. I leave these kind of things in here so I can make sure I remember them. Charles played on the football team. Charles, in middle school, Charles practiced every day, 5 days a week, him and his team for roughly, August till November, roughly football season. Because of segregation, they did not play one game. There was not one team that would play them. Boy Scouts are segregated to the point that a black Boy Scout troop could not go to a Boy Scout camp. And obviously what we hear about the most is lunch counters. In Nashville, when I was growing up until about the age, I'm gonna guess 12, 15 or something like that. Not quite sure the age, but somewhere in that range. Black people could buy food from lunch counters. It's the only place you could buy meals during the middle of the day if you worked downtown, but you could not eat at the lunch counter. You had to eat outside on the street. Also couldn't go into movie theaters. This is a picture of the Tennessean Theater in Nashville. It no longer exists, but that's a picture that shows you where the Tennessean used to be. And this is a picture of Z. Alexander Luby. And you see that he's circled. He is a city councilman. He was an attorney for civil rights students, and that included John Lewis. That's a name that you probably know, but there are probably many other people that you may not have heard of before. And one of these people is Diane Nash. So Attorney Luby lived in my same neighborhood. He went to the same church. I would pass his house as I walked to school and walked home from school. He lived maybe, I'm gonna guess, a block and a half. Again, I mentioned that I lived a block from Meharry. He lived right across the street from Meharry. This is his house that was bombed on, as you see the date, 1960. It's very fortunate that he and his wife were not hurt. They did not have children. Their bedroom was in the back of the room, the back of the house. That explosion was so loud that it woke both me and my brother up. This is from the same morning. This is Meharry Medical College. And if you look in the distance of the picture, you will see where his house is. But again, that gives you the impact of that blast. This is the same day, and this is Diane Nash leading the demonstration that happened that day from North Nashville to downtown Nashville. Again, another picture give you an idea of the size of the march. And this is Diane Nash, and if you've read about civil rights, you probably have heard the name C.T. Vivian, as they confront the mayor of Nashville. And this was a major civil rights movement because the mayor did admit that, yes, segregation was wrong. And this started a slow process of desegregating Nashville. This is Attorney Luby later that night. The night before, the night after. He receives a prolonged ovation. And this is at Fisk University, which again, Fisk is right across the street from Minardi University. And it's a picture of Dr. King talking. If you want to find out some more in terms of a very easy read, read March 1, the whole March series by John Lewis. It's a graphic novel. You learn a whole lot about this, and more importantly, you can read it in about an hour. And if you read all 3 series, you could probably read those in about 4 or 5 hours. This is, again, Diane Nash, and let me just mention Diane Nash, for the way people think about Martin Luther King, that's the way I think about Diane Nash. Okay, anybody reads anything about Diane Nash, they will be unbelievably impressed. And this is the day that the lunch counters were integrated. I got the names of everybody sitting there from my family members, my older siblings. This is Diane Nash in 2013. Diane Nash in 2016, sitting next to my sister. I was very happy, and if you see the little circle, that's me, very happy. Diane Nash was giving a talk at Vanderbilt. My brother-in-law died, oh my goodness, 20 years ago. And there's a lecture series at Vanderbilt in his name. And so we were there for that lecture series. And that's my sister's former husband. So let me tell you a little bit about the program for research on Black Americans. So I started there as a graduate student. And that's what sort of helped form the type of research that I do. I do just about exclusively survey research, but I do a few other things. And I started working there again as a grad student 40 years ago. We're one of the few groups that has a reunion. You don't think of most research teams having a reunion. We've had 2 reunions so far. This is a picture of our most recent reunion. And we also have made a sort of quiet, not well publicized contribution to the field of social work. These are people, some of them that you may know. Everybody I know knows Waldo Johnson. Yep. And in addition to them, there's a paper in Research on Social Work Practice that is about to come out. It's in press now, and it goes through the top cited African American scholars in the top 25 schools of social work. And 6 of us that are PRBA people are on that list. That includes my former student Karen Lincoln, it includes Sean Joe, and then my colleagues Trina Shanks, Daphne Watkins, and obviously my colleague in white, Flinda Chatters. In addition, as Jenny Jones mentioned, we have done 3 trainings now for the CSWE Minardi Fellows. I totally remember the time we met. And so this is my side of the story. Okay? So when we met, she said, you know, I'm running the Minority Scholars Program, and we just finished a conference here. And I said, you know, this was in San Francisco at the hotel. I said, wow, that's really expensive. I said, hey, if you can get the fellows to Michigan, and if you can take care of their housing, we will take care of everything else. Because we've been running summer programs for scholars for 20 years. And I said, you get them there, you house them, don't worry about the rest of the money, I'll figure out a way. I don't think she believed me. And so for about, I don't know, for like a month, I was emailing her like, okay, we doing this? Okay, we doing this? And then she said, yes, we have the money to do it. So, as I said, my research started off on older African Americans and African Americans over the life course. And I started in this area because my main mentor, James Jackson, that was his area of research. But in addition, that was also my future wife's area of research. So I'm not sure who was the major contribution, but it's somewhat equal. But there's also another reason. And again, here's my niece Vicky from a few years ago. And that's my mother. But and they're visiting an elderly relative. But my mother was also an MSW. And my mother also worked as an MSW with older African Americans. As a matter of fact, my mother ran what was called a friendship club, and where she went through the neighborhood and went through the Meharry Medical College catchment area, found older African Americans, especially ones that were not getting out the house much, and started this club. And what they did was every Wednesday, people come in for the afternoon, and they'd have events. So they would go to museums, they would go to movies, they would go to amusement parks, and my mother's role was pulling it together and getting the money to do these types of activities. This is an article in the newspaper where she was giving a seminar, a neighborhood seminar on caregiving and how caregivers need to take care of themselves. Again, this is 85. So, when I started in this area of older African Americans, this is what was going on. So what you see here is what? 1 out of 3 older African Americans were poor, and roughly 1 out of 3 had less than a 5th grade education. Well, why is that important? Obviously, poverty is critical, and remember, 1 out of 3. That's not a low number. And when you talk about less than a 5th grade education, you're also talking about functionally illiterate, which means things like medical directions, things like trying to get a mortgage, things like understanding how to pay telephone bills. A lot of the basic things are very difficult to do with a population that has such a high number of people who are functionally illiterate. Now, there are reasons for that. Remember, at that age, and we're talking about one-room schools and less money for schools, and a lot of people who were raised, who were sharecroppers. So there are lots of reasons for this, but that is still the reality. In addition, older African Americans during this period approached retirement with more unemployment, higher labor force dropout rates, more part-time work, and most importantly, you have to think about this. If you were, for this population at that point in time, there was really no such thing as retirement. Retirement means what? Retirement means you have a career. If you don't have a career, you have a series of jobs. And if you only have a series of jobs, there's nothing to retire from. And so we're also talking about people who did not have benefits. Okay? We're talking about people, again, not everybody, I'm by no means saying that, but I'm talking about a significant amount of people who are, again, sharecroppers who had lots of serial jobs as opposed to a career. Well, for me, this is important because what I thought about was, well, how does this group survive? How does a group that has such a high level of illiteracy, has a high level of poverty, how are they still here and why are they still, in essence, thriving? Okay? Not doing well. Remember, we're talking about inadequate housing, inadequate education, high levels of poverty, but still surviving. And that started my research on protective factors. So one is on families and the other on religion. For today, I'm not going to talk a lot about religion, but I'm going to talk about congregational support networks. So again, with the I started off as a graduate student working on the National Survey of Black Americans, and then I was a co-PI on the National Survey of American Life. And these are the principal investigators. Some of these names you may know, depending on the type of research you do, especially if you do mental health research. This is the end for the National Survey of American Life. And this is a sampling areas. If you take a look at the stars, first of all, let me mention these are approximate. For whatever reason, if I move the if I move the continental United States, the stars stay still. So they're not quite right, but they're close to right. And what you'll notice is two things. Number one is heavily in the northeast, and that's because of the Black Caribbean population. It's mostly northeast. Black Caribbean population is heavily in New York City and Connecticut and Washington, D.C. And the African American population is heavily in the South. So our survey is done, our sampling is done very different than the typical national sample. Typical national sample is a sample of the total population. Our sample is, and what it tends to do is undersample African Americans. Our sample is based on the distribution of African Americans and the distribution of Black Caribbeans in the population. So let me get a little bit into my research on family and congregational networks. So one thing about family networks that we know is the ties are permanent and they're explicit expectations. And we know that just because of the way families are. A person may not know their father, but they want to meet their father. Okay? That's a strong tie. You don't see that it's like, oh, this is a friend, I haven't met this person, but I want to meet them, right? You see that with families. With congregational networks, the ties are voluntary, like friendships. But different than friendships, there's a reciprocal history based on church involvement. And that's including an ethic of fellowship and spiritual helping, sharing of life events, and frequent shared experiences at church services and meeting of auxiliary groups. So I want to talk about two areas of research that I've been doing. Again, I can't cover everything, and this will be more breadth than depth. So one is I look at the correlates of family support networks, and then I look at the impact of emotional support and negative interaction on mental health. This is a 2013 paper. That was published in Family Relations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about not all the findings, but a few of just the family findings here. And what we see is this, is African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites are more likely to give or gave help to family more often, more likely to have daily family interaction, and compared to Black Caribbeans, interacted more frequently with family. So these are, again, not all the findings, these are some of the findings. And these essentially, I'm telling you the exact same thing, but this is in tabular form. Again, with what's highlighted in red as being the significant relationships. And the comparison group here is with African Americans. So again, it shows you Black Caribbeans have less daily contact and have less family contact, and whites have give support to each other less often. I said I had maybe, I can't remember, 27 dependent variables in this analysis, so I'm going to show you just some of these. We also covered friendships, fictive kin, and congregational support networks in this paper. So here's some basic findings, and which is why I covered that aspect of it in terms of family research. So first, consistent with prior work that shows that African Americans have similar or higher levels of involvement with kin than non-Hispanic whites. And let me tell you, the research in this area varies a lot. Some people may say it's all over the place. I would by no means agree with that. It sort of depends on what you're studying. If you're studying, say, help with somebody with diabetes, that's a different type than saying help with, in general, or help during an emergency, or help with money over financial crisis. These are all different types of support. And so in some cases you have no difference between African Americans and whites. Some differences, sometimes you have whites giving more support, and in some cases you have African Americans giving more support. Again, a lot of it depends on the context, and it depends on the group, and it depends on the situation. But it's also refutes the notion that African American kinship networks have significantly weakened. There was a period, I guess in the 1990s, early 2000s, especially among sociologists, who were saying that African American networks had weakened without any evidence. The evidence was, we don't see a difference now, but there may have been a difference because they're talking about Carol Stack's book in 1969. And in terms of research on Black Caribbeans, what you see is Black Caribbeans have transnational families. And what I mean by that is some of their, if you're from Jamaica, you may have family members in Brooklyn, New York. You may have family members who are still in Jamaica. You may have family members in London, or you might have family members in Toronto. So you have a highly dispersed group, and consequently it sort of makes sense that you don't have as much contact, certainly not as much daily contact. So I mentioned a former doctoral student who's a strong scholar herself, Karen Lincoln, who's at USC. And she really pushed me, because I was doing the family section of the National Survey of American Life, to put in negative interaction. And I wasn't as familiar with that level, with negative interaction as a concept, because at that point, most of my research was essentially who gives help and who gets help. Not as much as does help make a difference in terms of mental health or help seeking or anything else. But she really pushed me to do this, so we definitely put these measures in. And what turns out, they are some of the strongest measures that we've ever had in a survey, which could be a good or a bad thing, because negative interaction is by no means a good thing. And so what we see here, I know that's sort of small. So what we see here is through a number of papers, it almost doesn't matter what the mental health outcome is, negative interaction is bad. We see it with obsessive compulsive disorder. We see it with suicidal behaviors. We see it with PTSD. We see it with depressive symptoms, with mood disorders, with various psychiatric disorders. Just doesn't matter. A toxic, negative family environment is really bad for your mental health. Now, it's sort of a two-way street when you think about this. In some cases, it is the person who has the mental disorder that's causing the negative interaction. But in other cases, it's a family that has lots of negative interaction that helps lead to a mental disorder. We're not sure exactly which is the more potent way, which way the arrow goes the most, but we do know that it goes both ways. What's a prime example of negative interaction that we see on television all the time? All you have to use is the term Real Housewives. Doesn't matter what city, just say Real Housewives. I'll let you read this. This is from a focus group. And here is a second one. I found these quotes to be extremely powerful, and equally powerful, both of these are from Black men. Okay? This shows the importance of, for them, their church network. This was by no means everybody we interviewed in terms of focus groups. but it was the case for a significant but small group of men in particular. I actually remember running the focus groups and hearing these men say that, and I thought these are very powerful statements. But again, it shows you the importance of church members for some groups of individuals. So this is a more recent paper in Race and Social Problems, which is, as we know, which is the journal that Larry Davis runs out of University of Pittsburgh. And in this paper, we looked at the types of support. And this, again, solely from church members. And what you see is the most is help during illness, both in terms of receiving and providing. And what I've always been amazed about is a high number, relatively high percentage in terms of financial support. Now, I haven't done any racial comparisons with this as of yet, but we'll probably be doing that in the future. And here's some findings. So the negative, these are only significant relationships. There are other ones, age and gender were significant also. And I'm pretty sure there's a marital status and region differences here. But I only want to talk about these for this presentation because these caught me by surprise. And caught me by surprise because essentially what we have is that people with less education, people with lower levels of income, were the most heavily involved with church support networks. So for a lot of people go, well, that seems common sense. But if you know the religion research shows the opposite. The religion research in general shows that among African Americans and whites, as your education goes up, you're more likely to attend religious services. So most people think it's the opposite. The research is very clear on this. It's been clear on this since, I believe his name was Linsky, but I can't totally remember. And like a paper in like 1960 as an example. And it's been very consistent. And our research on African Americans has also been extremely consistent that higher educated much more attend religious services much more frequently. And the biggest predictor of receiving assistance is attending religious services. So this really caught me by surprise. But I think this sort of helps us understand why we always think of churches as being the place where poor people and less educated people are more actively involved, because they may be more actively involved in terms of giving and receiving instrumental types of support, not necessarily emotional support. Okay, I don't think there's an income and education difference there, but in terms of these types of financial assistance and help during illness. Help during illness are things like visiting people who are ill, providing meals for people who are ill, things like it could be transportation during illness, but the central part is during an illness. There's another paper that my wife Linda Chattis is first author on, and I believe this is the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, and against social support on depressive symptoms from both church and family members. So I just want to run down the dependent variables, and people who know mental health may be familiar with these dependent variables. So the CESD, and these are the items in the abbreviated 12-item CESD. And again, the more frequently you have these things, and you remember happiness and things hopeful are reverse coded, the higher number of depressive symptoms. The K6 is otherwise known as the Kessler-6, and it's really a measure of both depression and anxiety. It's a 6-item measure, and these are the items right here. So again, if you look at it, you can see the nervous and the restless or fidgety are measures of anxiety. The others are more measures of depression. And when we do the analysis, this is what we found. So number one, sort of to be expected, emotional support from family is negatively, or it buffers depressive symptoms and psychological distress. And as I mentioned before, negative interaction with family increases depressive symptoms and psychic distress. But we also see the emotional support from church members is inversely related with depressive symptoms and psych distress. And why is that? The reason that this is so important is because the belief was that, yes, you may find these church support items to be significant, but they really were a proxy for family support. Because a lot of people who did this research only did church support. They didn't include family support measures. This is the first paper that included family support, and lo and behold, the church support measures were still significant. The negative interaction from church members was significant until we included the negative interaction from family. And again, in that paper, there's several more tables, but this is the most important table right here. So, I have not been doing a great job of keeping up with my time, so I'm going to assume I have enough time, and talk a little bit about microaggressions and discrimination. So, we hear a lot about microaggressions in social work. We mostly, and let me just tell you how it started. It started with Chester Pierce, a black psychiatrist, writing in the early 70s. And then Derek Wing Su, most recently out of Columbia, has been doing a lot of writing. As a matter of fact, he has a lot of great YouTube videos on this topic, if you want to share those with your class. But the issue with this group of research is this, is that because they were psychologists and psychiatrists, they really are dealing mostly with the therapeutic relationship. And so they spend a lot of time dealing with unconscious types of aggressions, saying the types of things that may upset people, but the person unconsciously does not realize that they're upsetting somebody. And what you also see with this area of research is that at this point it's not very well developed. So the studies, again, tend to be smaller, they tend to be qualitative. A lot of studies are microaggressions with college students, microaggressions with LGBTQ clients. And with agents, with a variety of groups, but generally small, generally qualitative. But there is another body of research that's been going on a bit longer that's a lot more well established. Sorry, let me just mention, this is Derek Wing Su's, one of his major papers in American Psychologist in 2007. And what I just want to show you is this is his construct. So he has micro assaults and micro invalidations. Again, I'm going to just take a second so you can take a look at this. So, a lot of people in social work may or may not know about research on everyday discrimination. But this is an area that is much more highly developed. So this started with Femina Essett's book, Everyday Racism. And what she did in this book was really novel. She looked at black women in the United States and black women in the Netherlands and looked at, in an ethnographic book, talked about the types of discrimination they faced on an everyday basis. Then David Williams and James Jackson, but mostly David Williams, went through the book and developed a measure. to use in surveys. And that measure was first published in this paper, which is, again, I believe, a 2007 paper. And that paper's been cited over 2,000 times. This is a scale they came up with. You also see this term, everyday discrimination. You see the term perceived discrimination, self-reported discrimination, unfair treatment. There may be one or two other terms, so you see a lot of terms in the literature. I tend to use the term everyday discrimination. Again, this is the scale right here, and take a look, because I'm about to show you a paper that uses this scale, one or two papers that use this scale. And what you see here is that there are numerous studies in this area, including one with my colleague, or several with my colleague Michael Spencer on Asians, and David Takeuchi, that have been published in American Journal of Public Health. And what you see here is numerous findings. This is just an example, and more importantly, numerous findings in terms of health, mental health, and biomarker work. So mortality, poor sleep, coronary artery heart calcification, artery calcification. And so you see the others. Nighttime blood pressure, way more than this. There have been at least 4, 5, 6 meta-analyses to show you the number of papers that have been done in this area. If you want to take a look at some good lit reviews, just look up the name David Williams, and you'll see he's done great work in this area. As a matter of fact, he is clearly one of the pioneers of this area of research. Okay, excuse me. So this is a book, this is again, a recent article that I wrote with Verna Keith. And this is using that measure of discrimination, everyday discrimination. And this was published earlier this year in Sociological Inquiry. And what we did here is we used latent class analysis to, and I've been doing something that's a little different than what a lot of other people do in this area. A lot of people look at discrimination in terms of discrimination in blood pressure, discrimination in mental health. We've been also looking at who gets discriminated against the most, what groups, what individuals among African Americans. So in this paper, what we did is, using latent class analysis, we found 4 classes. So one class is just low levels across all the 10 indicators of discrimination. One is the high levels, high across all 10. One is more the disrespect and disrespect, so like less respect, less courtesy. And then one is the more character-based, which is a more serious type. So not as much, low levels in terms of disrespect, but high levels in terms of character. And again, I will show you this in terms of the graphs on this. So again, if you look at the light green, you'll see how it's high across all the indicators. That's the high discrimination. If you look at, I guess that's a teal color, and you see that that's low across all 10. And then you see the other two, whereas high among one group and low among the other group. Some of the more interesting findings here in terms of demographic findings is that among African Americans, okay, not a comparison group, among African Americans, those with higher levels of education, those who have white-collar jobs, experience the highest levels of discrimination, of perceived discrimination. And the reason why is because people have more exposure. So again, if you live in I'll use the example of Washington, D.C., and you are living close to Howard, and you're working in a a blue-collar job, or say you work at Howard in a blue-collar job, the bulk of your life, the bulk of your exposure is only among African Americans, okay? However, if you are in a corporation where there are very few African Americans, odds are you have more chances of exposure to negative discriminatory events. So another paper with Reuben Miller. Reuben is a very strong researcher in terms of criminal justice. So again, this paper is only among African American men. And what we find here is, which is consistent with the research, is again, as younger men have more discrimination, that's really consistent regardless of the group. Education is positive related. Again, that's really consistent. But what we also find is African American men who spend time in jail or prison experience the most frequent level of discrimination. One thing that most people may not know, and that I didn't know until I was doing this research because I thought the numbers were wrong. In our survey, we found that 52% of African American men had been arrested at some point during their lives. And I said, oh, this must be wrong, that we must have a mistake in the data. And everybody said, oh, no, that's right. And that totally shocked me. This is the last paper I'm going to share with you. And this is, again, solely among older African Americans. And again, it's with psychiatric disorders. And yeah, I know y'all can't read that. Okay, so, I'm going to tell you on the computer screen, it doesn't look that small. So here's the bottom line. Because I'll be honest, I can barely read it from the monitor I'm looking at, okay? So the bottom line is this, is that if you see there are two little squares there, those are the only findings that are insignificant. Essentially, those are the only ones that are insignificant. Bottom line is discrimination is positively associated with every psychiatric disorder in this analysis. Because we're dealing with older African Americans, the ends are smaller, so we had to do some composite measures. So the composite measure, I guess mood disorders, anxiety disorder, any disorder, the number of disorders, and then we also did the measures I explained before, the CESD, and in addition to that, the K6, the Kessler-6. And what you see again across all of these measures is that discrimination is positively associated with psychiatric disorders. So, I have a quick conclusion here. It's one of 5 points. So number one, despite years of discrimination, low levels of socioeconomic status, older African Americans have survived. Large part due to their families, a large part due to their religion. Negative interaction with families creates a toxic environment and is a risk factor for psychiatric disorders and for suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. Religious communities provide a sense of belonging and social integration, which combined has a positive impact on mental health. Everyday discrimination is a significant stressor that has a negative impact on mental and physical health. Part of, people have been doing a lot of work on this. There are several aspects to discrimination that lead to negative outcomes, and one is the discrimination itself, but another is the vigilance that people have towards discrimination, that they have experienced it so much that you become afraid that you're going to experience it, and that fear of experiencing it also leads to negative mental health. And You may see a little, it's newer research, the term is racial vigilance. And lastly, I am proud and honored to be the Carl Scott Lecturer of 2017. Thank you. Thank you.
Again, it is my pleasure and honor to present to you, Dr. Taylor, this plaque that reads, "The Council on Social Work Education, the Commission for Diversity and Social and Economic Justice, in recognition of Robert Joseph Taylor, 2017 Carl A. Scott Memorial Lecturer, continuing Carl A. Scott's legacy of equity and justice in social work."
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
All right, if y'all would look right here, look good. Two of you look good, okay. Look in there, wonderful. One more. Got it, very good.
Thank you.
Which two?
Thank you. If you don't mind, I have one little point I want to make about my mother. I go by Robert Joseph Taylor because when I was, I guess, in 9th grade, she got me a checking account. And she said, almost the exact words, "Boy, always use your middle name because there are too many Robert Taylors in this world." Okay, and if any of us people who are older remember the Robert Taylor, the actor, and there's numerous Robert Taylors, so that's why I'm always Robert Joseph Taylor. Thanks to my mother.